India wouldn't have been the country it is without the British rule.
True.
In Urdu, there's a word that we use, there's a phrase that we use which we call Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb. It's not only the leaders, but it's the common
Common
people
Yeah.
who can drive a movement and who
Right.
can bring about a change.
Yeah.
I think I am a centrist with a little bit of a leaning towards the left.
Discover unseen history. Listen now on History Uncovered.
Hi guys, welcome back to our podcast History Uncovered, where we discuss unseen history from an unbiased perspective with a twist of humor. In this episode, we have the privilege of hosting Miss Anu. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's great to have you with us here.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know who she is our high school history teacher, and she comes with a lot of experience in her field across different boards and different schools.
So this will be a 2-episode series on communalism versus like the freedom struggle in India before the independence. So if you want to watch the second episode to this series, you can find the link to it in the description. We can start the first episode by knowing a little more about Miss Anu. So we have a couple of questions for you before we jump into the episode.
Sure.
Okay, so our first question is like, how many years of experience do you have, and what are the places that you've taught at?
So I have close to almost 30 years of experience now. I started teaching in Delhi in a school called Delhi Public School, if you know of that. And then I moved on, like after a couple of years, like almost 7-8 years of teaching there, I moved to Mumbai when I started teaching. I taught very briefly at Aryavidya Mandir, but that was a very brief 1 year. And then I was at Dhirubhai Ambani for almost a decade. And after which I'm here like I've been in OIS for the last 7 years.
Wow, quite a journey. Our next question is where and what did you study at university, and how was your life growing up? Like, was it closely related to politics, history?
So I grew up in the north, and in the north, almost every household has a political side to it because dinner table discussions are always about politics, and that's where I think politics and history, you cannot separate the two.
Yeah.
So for me, those were like really formative years. Like my parents tell me that when I was a child, I think about 3 or 4 years old, there used to be this magazine that maybe a lot of your parents may remember. It was called the Illustrated Weekly of India, and it was like this long magazine. And I would actually turn the pages. I couldn't read. I could turn the pages and identify Indira Gandhi and Jay Prakash Narayan, people you probably haven't heard of. And I knew, like, I could identify those people. So I think my being, my tryst with history and politics started very young. Also, I grew up in a town which is near Delhi, but I think everybody knows of it, especially the history students. I did my schooling in a town called Meerut because that's where the revolt of 1857 started. And like, the map of Meerut is dotted with places where events of 1857, or the Gadar as it is called, were held. And then my family belonged to Delhi, so I went to Delhi University. I went to Lady Shri Ram College where I did history, and then I went to St. Stephen's College in Delhi University again, where I did my masters in history. So with politics as a minor, like in my undergrad. So that my journey in throughout college was history and politics.
Yeah. So like after university, how did you decide to become like a history teacher, and like who inspired you to become like a teacher?
So I was taught, I think, by the best. A lot of people whose books are read today, like people I've grown up listening to, like attending lectures by Romila Thapar, by Sumit Sarkar, by people like Dr. D.N. Jha and Sri Mali, who are like really big names. I was taught by Dr. Nayanjot Lahiri, who was the Dean of History at Delhi University and now teaches at Ashoka, and Professor Upinder Singh, who again teaches at Ashoka. So I was taught by all these people, and when they were such inspiring teachers that it became clear to me that I would do nothing else but teach like them. And in fact, I remember having a discussion with my professor who said that I would be a great university teacher. I told her that no, I want to teach at school because I feel that's where you can actually get people interested in history.
Yeah.
By the time they come to university, they've already made up their mind that they like history. But you can make the shift and you can make a change more at school level, and that's how I decided to become a school teacher.
So the viewers greatly know that I'm really experienced. So the next question is, what's your favorite topic to talk about in history, or what's that one topic which always comes about at the family dinner table?
So these days it's very fashionable to debunk history the way it was written. But as students of history, you guys know that I really enjoy subaltern studies, and I really, really enjoy reading and knowing more about Gandhi and his role in the movement, and different facets of the movement, where the freedom movement, where Gandhi kind of played a role positively and even in a very benign manner. So that is something that I really, really enjoy. And the second thing, which is absolutely very, very close to my heart, also because I saw a lot of it around me, the impact around me while growing up, is the partition. So the partition movement and the impact of partition is something that is very, very important.
Yeah, so like obviously when we look at history, political alignments of historians are important. So what would you say is like your alignment?
I think I am a centrist with a little bit of a leaning towards the left. To be very honest, that's something that I enjoy.
So I think by now the audience should have greatly understood who you are and really grasped your love for history as a subject. Now, swiftly moving on to the hot topic for the day, Indian communalism.
Okay, so our first question is, what is communalism in the context of India? And as per Bipin Chandra, it's an ideology that is based on the belief that Indian society is divided into religious communities whose economic, political, social and cultural differences diverge and are even hostile to each other because of these religious differences. So what is your take on communalism in India?
So, the way we saw communalism in history, obviously it's evolved now.
Yeah.
Now, the way history is looked at, the way history is done now, is used now, is for communal divide, is absolutely a rewriting of history. Okay, so communalism is basically, of course, the biggest divide that can be created for, and I would add the word like personal gains, right?
Yeah.
It can be a personal gain of a community, it can be a personal gain of a political party, it can be a personal gain of a leader, it can be a personal gain of an individual. So so communalism is the great divide that happens in communities, and it is almost always in the Indian context, it has been on the basis of religion. Like
Yeah.
there have been Shia and Sunni rights, but that have also been on the basis of religion. Whether it has been Hinduism and amongst Hindus and Muslims, that has also been on the basis of religion. There have been caste rights in India; those have also been communal. That have been like in Hindus, amongst Hindus, but again like caste rights, that has also been different. But that is also in the name of religion that ultimately it happens, divides in religion, right?
So,
Yeah.
what do you think is like the role of communalism, or how is it seen in the present society? How has it progressed from, say, like the 19th century to right now in India?
The progression.
I think we've progressed for the worse in this direction. In a lot of things, like if we look at history, earlier we could blame the British for communalism.
Yeah.
Now we only have ourselves to blame for
That's
it.
true.
Right? So we and earlier we could say we were not educated enough to become like, to be pawned around by the British. But now we are educated and we are still fighting in the name of religion.
Yeah,
We are
that's true.
voting in the name of religion. We are looking at societies in the name of religion. So obviously this is not progression. This is regression.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Okay, so to understand the independence movement better, we consider various perspectives of historians. So for the purpose of this podcast, we'll be looking at 4 different perspectives. So the first one is imperialist historians, and their perspective is also known as history from above because they focus on the role of like Mountbatten and Irwin.
So, if you're not already aware, Lord Mountbatten was a British officer who was the last Viceroy of India and the first Governor General of independent India. And Lord Irwin was another Viceroy of India who attempted to negotiate between the British government and the Indian leaders for self-governments in India, which eventually culminated in the Gandhi-Irwin Pact in 1931.
Okay, so imperialist like historians discuss the role that the British played in bringing about change in the form of like infrastructure such as the railway and communication systems, as well as administration and government. They also see the British as positive in their role in the independence movement, and their view is that
India, like the British
Yeah.
rule was really helpful for India.
yeah.
So, how do you think the imperialist historians would justify the view that Britain's role in the progress towards Indian independence was positive? And like, what are some examples of the infrastructure and the systems which they had, which they placed?
So it's a perspective,
Yeah,
definitely.
definitely.
But it is a positive perspective. We do know that India wouldn't have been the country it is without the British rule.
True.
Okay, while we do know that there were problems with the British rule, and a lot of us who are like students of history and teachers of history, people like you and me, we do criticize the British rule on certain occasions. But it's important to remember that you can't throw away the baby with the bathwater. So it's important that we understand that British rule did bring about changes in India. We were a very fragmented society. The fact that we got a centralized rule, the fact that we got English as a link language, the fact that we would be studying in pathshalas and madarsas if it hadn't been for the British and the British education system that came in, the fact that they brought in railway lines. They brought in like railways in India which connected people from different parts of the country. Like if I sat in a coupe and like we all know that they practice racialism and the fact that racism, and we could
white man's
only
burden.
they like India was a white man's burden for
Yeah.
them. They had to they took it upon themselves that they had to civilize because we weren't civilized enough for them, which is of course the negative. But the fact that we did get an education, they opened our world to ideas such as democracy. They opened our eyes to ideas such as we could identify racism. We got to read English literature. We got to read what was happening in other parts of the world. So in that sense, yes, they did play a very important role. Like we could, the kind of medicine that we have in India today, or the kind of like the fact that the writings, like I love reading. I enjoy reading as a hobby, and some of my favorite authors are Indian authors who write in English. And I often think that it hadn't been for the British, we wouldn't get to read such wonderful literature in English, which is
That's true.
accessible to everyone in the world.
Yeah.
So they opened up India to the rest of the world, and for the Indians, they gave us a window to the rest of the world. So I think In that sense, the British really played an important role by being in India.
So, do you believe that it had like, a, what do you think was the extent of the positive effect the British had?
Uh, Let me put it this way, that their intentions were not positive.
Yeah,
What we
definitely.
got out of it was positive, but the intentions were definitely not positive. They were here to they you know, I was reading somewhere and it said England is a nation of shopkeepers. Okay, they were here to make money
Yeah.
trading. They were here for economic motives. If in the bargain, if we got educated, like when they brought in English education, for example, the whole purpose was to have really low paid clerks
Yeah.
who would just run the administration for them.
Yeah.
Right? So that they didn't have to get, writers from England to come and work here who were paid exorbitant salaries, and they went back so much so with so much money that they were called nabobs. So they wanted to cut down on cost like a good businessman.
Yeah.
They wanted to cut down on cost, and they said, okay, let's teach them. Let's teach them to run our administration. And so in the bargain, we got educated. So they didn't really, but they weren't here to like kind of, do us a favor. Like, but in the bargain, we got what we got.
Yeah, so the initial intentions were pretty negative, but
Yes.
like
Yeah.
the byproduct which we got as a result was pretty positive, and it helped us as a
Yes.
country.
Yes.
So another important perspective to consider while we understand this topic further is the view of nationalist historians, Indians who achieved independence through their own efforts. In their view, Britain left India because it could no longer hold back the tide of the resistance posed by the Indian National Congress and the Indian leaders. So nationalist historians place special focus on the roles played by the Congress and other prominent Indian leaders such as Gandhi and Nehru in the independence movement. For the sake of this video, we will be referring to historian R.C. Majumdar. So, what do you think are their possible views on communalism?
So for the nationalist historians had a very important task to represent India as one united whole. So they would go back into history to show that Hindus and Muslims have always been together. They've always worked together. They've always worked side by side. Like in Urdu, there's a word that we use, there's a phrase that we use which we call Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb. Ganga Jamuna means that there are two rivers that are separate,
Yeah.
but then they unite, they join somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So Ganga and Jamuna for them were like, the Hindus and the Muslims.
Right.
They were different, but they were always together, and that was that was the focus of the nationalist historians, to say even in the revolt of 1857 we were together. Even before that we were together. So for nationalist historians, that idea is very, very important. And so for them, like they didn't dwell so much, but there are some nationalist historians, amongst others, who laid more stress on India being a country of Hindus, the majority of the country being Hindus. So in that sense, some of them did like kind of lay stress on Hinduism, and they were like, they were themselves like staunch Hindus, and it came out in their writings.
So, do you think these type of historians actually played an important role in unifying various sections of the society for the independence movements?
Yes and no. When the narrative got too Hindu, like they stressed on Hindu rulers of India,
Yeah.
old Hindu
Yeah.
rulers of India. They talked about like the glorious days of India were when the Hindu rulers were ruling. That part kind of alienated the Muslim population, but at other times they tried to bring, like, some of their writings brought the Hindus and Muslims together.
So there's always the two sides.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay, yeah, so our third perspective is subordinate studies, and historians in this field normally talk about the role that ordinary like people played in the independence movement. And like for our podcast, we're looking at Aisha Jalal, and obviously she has a strong bias because obviously she's of Pakistani descent, and like her opinions like are different from ours. So what is your perspective on like her as a historian?
So, like you said, every historian comes in with their own bias.
Yeah.
Okay, they're like, we are all sum total, we are always products of what our own history is and what our own culture is.
Yeah.
So she does, like, for her, like, Jinnah is more important than Gandhi, and Jinnah, like, their role, they look at Jinnah differently.
Yeah.
They don't look at Jinnah like the way we look, but then people who were with Jinnah, people who were not with Jinnah, those are like the things that they focus on. But in India, you would have like some other historians. You would have, for example, people like Shahid Amin, for example. Though he's a Muslim, but for him, like, the focus of his studies has been Gandhi, right? And the role that Gandhi played in bringing masses together, in bringing communities together. In fact, like, he talks about, like, how Gandhi was looked at as Mahatma by the common people. He talks about that. He talks about how common people just viewed him as somebody who said that absolute gospel truth, and they would follow him for what he was, and the kind of life that he lived for the people was, like, amongst them, was that everybody kind of came with him, and that solidified the national movement. So the focus of subaltern studies, perspectives may be different, but the subaltern studies always look at the role of common people in a movement. And I think as IB students, we realize that it's not only the leaders, but it's the common people
yeah.
who can drive a movement and who
Right.
can bring about a change.
Yeah.
And that's what subaltern studies focuses on.
So for a lot of people watching this podcast, so we really learned that what your perspective is shaped by your background and
Yeah.
your origin. Even though you're supposed to be like a historian, you're supposed to be unbiased, but you always come with a side of perspective on like what you think is correct because of what you have been taught. So finally, we have the Marxist perspective, who view the British as exploitative. They also analyze the Indian nationalist movement from a class perspective and see it as the serving the interests of the elite groups, rather than representing the Indian people as a whole, so the Indian community as a whole. They question whether the process of decolonization and subsequent independence was actually beneficial for the masses in the post-colonial India. So for the sake of this podcast, we will be referring to Bipin Chandra for these perspectives. So do you have any additions to these which would help us understand Indian history?
Like, are there any other historians who like are important to understand Indian independence?
From this perspective?
Definitely, like, you can go back right to ancient India and come forward.
Yeah.
Like, for example, like, history is to be studied in continuity. So you start with Romila Thapar and R.S. Sharma, who actually talk about the making of entire Indian society,
Yeah.
which was based on basically just money and economics and class structures. Okay, like, that is what played an important role in it. And then as you moved forward, you have people like Irfan Habib who talk about this. And then when you, of course, like, Bipin Chandra does it like brilliantly, where he talks about the role of Marxism in history. But one of my favorite books actually which I read was Nehru's History of India, where Nehru himself was such a, like, he had Marxist leanings as well, about this.
Yeah,
And
socialist,
yes,
yeah.
there's socialist Marxist leanings, more socialist, less
Yeah.
Marxist, but yes, definitely leftist leanings.
Yeah.
He had those, and his whole history of India is actually it's just about it's based on class structures. So he recounts, like, absolutely like the beginning of civilization in India till independence. Everything is just based on exploitation and money. The ruling classes exploit the poor classes, which finally leads to a revolution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, so that's what they talk about throughout. And of course there's Sumit Sarkar, who along with Bipin Chandra also talks about it, and many more historians who have written about this. But then it's something that is an ongoing narrative even
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
Right, we do hear of people who write this with Marxist leanings.
So now that we've explored these four perspectives, let's move forward from perspectives and onto facts. So about the revolt of 1857. Bahadur Shah II was the last emperor of the reigning Mughal dynasty, So who he was really significant as a figurehead in the first war of independence, which was the 1857 revolt. Could you tell us a bit more about the 1857 revolt, which not a lot of viewers may be knowing, like anything in detail?
Okay, so Revolt of 1857 happened it started in Meerut, went on to Delhi, spread to other centers in the country. It was essentially the first revolt against the British, in which a lot of other classes joined, but it was started by British soldiers. Okay, and there are different perspectives to it. You all know about it.
Yeah.
That there are different perspectives. The British just decide to call it a mutiny. They say no, 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 nothing else happened. Only there was just a mutiny of soldiers. But there were other people like landlords, farmers, religious men and women who got involved in it, and so it became. It was actually much bigger than a mutiny.
Right.
So Indians like to call it the first war of Indian independence because it
Yeah.
was in some way a little bit organized, uh, you know, event and a movement against the British. So this, which really kind of shook them up, and you know that as an
Yeah.
aftermath of the
Yeah.
revolt of 1857, the British said enough. The East India Company cannot hold India, which is so important for us. So now the rule of the country is going to shift from East India Company to
The
the
British
British
power.
Crown.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was a very big thing that shook the crown.
Yeah.
If it was a mere mutiny, that wouldn't have happened. And so, yes, the aim of the mutineers was, or the people who revolted, was to put Bahadur Shah Zafar back on the throne because he was the last Mughal emperor, and they thought that it would be nice to put him back on the throne.
Yeah.
Also, there's a reason where it was there was a news that the rifles, they had cartridges which was
Yes.
lined with the fat of pigs and cows, which was against the religion of both the Hindus and the Muslims.
Yes.
So, do you think that was the only reason, or was it because resistance to the British rule as such was being built up for all these years, and it came out in the form of this revolt?
Yes. So there's always in history, as students of history, we all know that in history there's always like, there's a build up and then there's a trigger.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So the trigger was the grease cartridges, but over and above that, there was a lot happening otherwise, like, whether it was in the army, socially, it was happening in terms of religion, it was happening in terms of the way, politically the British were governing
Yeah.
India. So there was a lot happening otherwise as well. This was just came as a final blow.
Okay, so like Bipin Chandra also like sort of is critical of the imperialist perspective that it was just a mutiny, but he also goes on to talk about how it kind of led towards a unified movement against the British. So like, do you agree with this?
Definitely, because in the aftermath of the revolt, people realized that the British have, they have shaped up, and it was
Yeah.
important for Indians to shape up as well, to get together, and that's when the whole idea of, interestingly and ironically, the whole idea of the Congress came up. Not ironically, because not from the Indians themselves, but from the British, but it proved to be a blessing in disguise for them. So it was an event where they kind of shaped up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, coming back to the Mughal dynasty, so how do you think it related to the communalism in the Indian society back then?
If you're talking about before 1857,
Yeah.
it was a pretty unified society.
Okay.
There were people in the court of Mughals that were both Hindus and Muslims, and they had equal power. If you go back to the times of, let's say, people during the time of Akbar, if you would have studied that Akbar had his 9 ratnas.
Yeah.
And it was a good mix of Hindus and Muslims. You hear
Yeah.
of names like Birbal, who was a high class Brahmin. There was Todarmal. There was there was Tansen, who was the singer in his
Yeah.
court. There was, like, along with other like Rahim Khan Khana and other people who were Muslims. So it was a very good mix. All Mughal princes had uh, Hindu wives, some Hindu wives. You know that there was polygamy that was
Yeah.
practiced
Yeah.
at that time, but the reasons for polygamy were like, I mean, whatever their personal reasons would have been, I don't know about that. But yeah, it was definitely political, because they had to win over the Hindu rulers as their
Yeah.
allies. So they were like, they almost all of them had Hindu, princesses as their wives. They like they had this thing. Bahadur Shah Zafar particularly, like he was a poet.
Yeah.
He was
Yeah.
a poet. A lot of his poetry refers to Brahmins, and it refers to Hindus. It refers to, like, very interesting stuff comes across in his poetry. The other thing about Bahadur Shah Zafar is, very interestingly, I'll give you a piece of trivia. He started a festival in Delhi that was celebrated during my childhood. I don't know if it's celebrated even now. From the time of the Mughals till I'm
Yeah.
talking about the
Yeah.
1980s and early 1990s that it was celebrated. It was called Phool Walon Ki Sair. Phool Walon Ki Sair as a festival was started by Bahadur Shah Zafar, and it really celebrated the mixed heritage of Dilliwalas. So it started at a dargah and it ended at a temple. So
Yeah.
it was just a festival to celebrate the spirit of oneness um, in Delhi.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was the culture of the Mughals. And while there are, like, people who talk about that, oh, the Mughals imposed jizya, they used to collect taxes, they used to trouble the Hindus. Um, there are also rulers like Akbar. Akbar abolished jizya.
Yeah.
Okay, Aurangzeb reimposed it because he had inherited an empty treasury, and he had to fight so many wars. He had to fight wars with the Sikhs. He had to fight war with the Marathas. There were people who were troubling him, like, at the borders, in the Afghans. So he had to fight. So he inherited the largest empire with no money. So he had to tax the population that was the biggest component in amongst his subjects, and that population were the Hindus. It was so easy, like, it was the best idea for him to actually tax the Hindus, and that's why he reimposed the jizya.
So it had less to do with religion, you'd say, or
Less to It was more of an economic
yeah,
consideration.
Right.
more than
Right?
religious.
I'm sure, like, see, I have also, research also proves about him that he himself was a very devout Muslim
Yeah.
who thought that Islam would be like it's a gateway to heaven.
Yeah.
He firmly believed in it. So he thought that, okay, in the bargain, if people cannot pay, if they turn to Islam, it will be good for them.
Yeah.
Okay, but he himself he led a very simple lifestyle. It was, the research has proved, historical research has proved that about him. But he firmly had to, like, he had no other choice but to reimpose jizya, because he wanted those taxes to fight wars and run an empire.
So, pre 1857, Hindu Muslim unity was extremely important. So, what do you think was the significance of them coming together, rallying for a Mughal emperor, which was Bahadur Shah Zafar too, like against getting him to the throne instead of the British? And if he would have become the emperor of India that at that time, how do you think it would have changed the country as a whole?
I'm not too sure about that, because people say we can rewrite history.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to rewrite history.
Yeah.
I'm not very sure that things would have changed for better if Bahadur Shah Zafar came onto the throne. I'll tell you why. Because when they wanted to put him back on throne, he was an old man of almost 80
Yeah.
years. His sons had been killed. He'd lost his spirit to live. If you put a man who's that old and who's depleted all his energy, and he was really not someone who would have been able to hold the empire together at that point of time. So again, there would have been wars, there would have been, like, bloodshed, there would have been stuff after which he would have been dethroned. Many more people would have died, and the British would have come up again. So it wouldn't have really served any purpose, but it's worth a mention in history, because To counter the narrative of communalism, Hindus and Muslims fought together in the first war of Indian independence to bring an old ruler who had given them good times as a community and not discriminated
Yeah.
against them, to bring them together.
Right.
Bring him back.
Yeah. So like a lot of like historians such as Bipin Chandra and like R.C. Majumdar, as well as we looked at Lawrence James, they all agree on the fact that it was also economic reasons that led to the mutiny. Like, could you give us some like context behind this?
So it is taxation was very, very heavy for the Indians.
Yeah.
Indian artisans were dying because their cloth was way more expensive compared to the cloth that was being brought in, machine made cloth that was being brought in from England.
Right.
That cloth wasn't being taxed. That cloth, there were no import duties.
Yeah.
Whereas taxation for own cloth produced in India by hand, there was like, it was very, very high.
Yeah.
Cotton was sold at very expensive prices. Cloth was taxed. So obviously it became very expensive. And so because the cloth didn't get sold, people were facing, the artisans faced poverty. Lots of people went out of work.
Yeah.
Indian farmers being forced to grow cash crops, cotton, indigo, which was beneficial to industries in the UK,
Yeah.
and not like in England, and not like, food crops. It led to famines in India. It led to food shortages in India. So the whole, the whole economy of the country was rebuilt to suit the needs of England as a country.
Yeah.
We became like India became like a feeder country that was feeding their economy. And like Dadabhai Naoroji talked about the drain of wealth from
Yeah.
India, where there was wealth from India that was just going there and nothing was getting reinvested.
No proportionate return.
Yes, no proportionate return, nothing getting reinvested in our country back again. That obviously led to like Indians literally bleeding to economic death.
Yeah.
And that is something that really impacted us.
Right.
So, yes, I mean, 1857 was a war that was fought like nothing much changed for Indians per se, because earlier it was
Yeah.
the East India Company. It was now just replaced by the British
So
Crown.
only namesake change.
Only namesake. Like if I was an Indian living at that time, things wouldn't mean anything to me other than the fact that now like there's somebody else who's come in place of like person X
Yeah.
who's British has been replaced by person Y, but things remained the same for them.
And also
right?
they kind of got worse because now the British were focused on breaking down the Indians even more, so they couldn't
Yeah. They
or
can't
like have a
revolt.
revolt like that ever
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
So now we understand that it is a combination of factors which got the Hindus and Muslim together to revolt in 1857, and it was truly a very proud moment for the Indians, as it was their first war for independence. So about the communalism in India, jumping forward to after independence. So have you had any like stories shared to you from your ancestors about the partition?
Like your family background.
Yeah.
From the partition.
We'd love to hear them.
Okay, based on communalism?
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, I mean, there are lots and lots of stories from friends and families about the homes that they had and how, they had to leave those in the middle of the night with people, and it wasn't safe for families to travel alone, so they would travel together. There were people who were like, whose homes and establishments were just attacked by mobs, and they just had to put down a shutter and lock the shop or the establishment with a view that they're going to come back to it.
Right.
They all thought that they would go back to it at some
Yeah.
stage, but that really didn't happen. They had to just, people moved with like their one, like their small belongings, and everything else was just lost there. Like So there are loads and loads of stories like that which exist. I was just talking to a friend of mine who was telling me that her father, who's now almost 94 years old, he went to he studied in the medical college at Lahore,
Right.
and he had come to Simla on a holiday.
Mm-hmm.
And when the riots broke out and the country was partitioned, he couldn't go back to his medical college
Yeah.
there.
Right.
He just couldn't. The rest of his family moved from there, and they actually came to one of the towns in the north. And while he was stuck, the rioting had broken out. He was stuck somewhere in Punjab, and the family was separated for many years. Then he actually, with great difficulty, he had to write exams to prove that he was a medical student,
Yeah.
and he got
Hmm.
admission
Yeah.
in Amritsar Medical College, and that's when he completed his degree. So yeah, I mean, there are lots and lots of stories like
It was
that.
a really sad time. A lot of people suffered. So that was great to listen to. It had a profound
Yeah,
impact on
impact.
us, and I'm sure it has been the same for the
Yeah.
audience listening. Thank you so much for taking out the time to record this podcast with us. If you want to watch the second episode, you can find the link in the description. We had a really fun and interesting time. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you. It's
you.
been a pleasure.